Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Education Writers Association webinar, Critical Race Theory 101, Essential Context for Reporters. My name is Stacia Cedillo, and I'm a program manager here at EWA. Let me now turn it over to today's moderator, Ruth Servan-Smith. Go ahead, take it away, Ruth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ruth Servan-Smith. I'm the education editor for the Alabama Education Lab at AL.com. I'll be moderating today's discussion around the unfolding political fight against critical race theory. In our own reporting at the Ed Lab, we have explained how the term has become a catch-all phrase for efforts to expand history, diversity, and anti-racism in schools. And misleading claims that CRT is being taught in K-12 schools, which isn't the case in Alabama or, as far as I know, anywhere in the country. We have a few goals for today's discussion. First, we want to give some background. We'll ask our speakers to explain what exactly critical race theory is and how it is used by scholars in education research. Second, we'd also like to give context. We want to dig into the political and social contexts that are driving the discourse and activism we're seeing across state houses, in school board meetings, and in social media. We also want to talk about the potential impacts we will see from legislation around the country that's either explicitly barring critical race theory in classrooms or taking aim at more general anti-racism and anti-bias training. We also want to help you as you report on these issues in your communities. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and we'll talk about some ways that education journalists can tackle misinformation in their reporting, along with some tangible tips and story ideas. So to introduce our distinguished panelists, we have Dr. Keffrelyn Brown, Professor of Cultural Studies and Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at UT Austin. Dr. Brown is a former teacher and was a member of the 1995 Teach for America cohort. Next, we have Dr. Nolan Cabrera, Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Practice at the University of Arizona. Dr. Cabrera is the author of White Guys on Campus and was an expert witness in the federal trial regarding Arizona banning Mexican American studies in Tucson. And finally, we are also joined by Jaime Longoria, who is a senior investigative researcher at First Draft. Jaime's work at First Draft has included covering how misinformation has affected Latinx communities. So to dive in, let's start with the basics. Dr. Brown, you have used critical race theory in your research, and you've taught courses on how the framework affects teacher professional development, curriculum, and other issues. What is critical race theory?
Great, thank you so much for having me today. CRT, or critical race theory, is simply a framework that's used to examine and understand how race and racism operate, first in the United States, but also it's been picked up and used in other countries and other settings. It comes out of legal studies as a way to make sense of why, after abolishing legal racial segregation, racism continued to exist and continues to exist in our society. CRT essentially recognizes that racism plays a founding and pivotal role in U.S. social relations. In other words, this country was founded, racism goes back to at least the founding of this country, which means that it's deeply ingrained in our social fabric. It also acknowledges that when racial progress is made in society, that progress is often met with backlash that works to neutralize that progress and places racial equity efforts further back. And then finally, I guess I'll say that many different disciplines have utilized CRT to sort of explain how race and racism operate within that field and within the spaces that they study, including education. So that's a good start, I think.
Thank you. And Dr. Cabrera, we've already kind of laid out a skepticism that the current culture war issue is actually about CRT, but can you kind of lay out some things that CRT is not?
Of course, and because right now anything that mentions race or diversity sort of gets put under this umbrella of critical race theory. And so first and foremost, just general diversity efforts are not critical race theory oriented, or they tend not to be. A lot of that tends to be rooted in multiculturalism, which is more of the idea of, hey, I'm going to examine how you're different and I'm different, and through some kumbaya symbiosis, we're going to come together and, hold hands. And really, that has nothing to do with the structures of society, the systemic inequities that we're dealing with. It's been really interesting too, because there's been a persistent push to say that critical whiteness studies is critical race theory. Again, just anything that's race forward, race conscious, and that's just fundamentally false. W.B. Du Bois was doing critical whiteness scholarship back in the 1920s, and that kind of preceded critical race theory by about 60 years. But the point being more that, just because everything is lumped together as critical race theory, doesn't necessarily, in a political discourse, doesn't necessarily mean that it's so.
And would it also be fair to say that there's nothing inherent in the framework of critical race theory as a discipline that says it's teaching white people to hate themselves or feel bad because of their race?
Critical race theory attacks racism. So the only way that you're being attacked as a white person and would feel shame is if you're being racist. So the political activist death protest too much, methinks, on those ones. So there's nothing inherent about it. It's a structural relation, and it's looking at systemic inequities. And if you on your actions are supporting that, then you might feel bad about it. But there's nothing inherent that says that white people need to feel bad and white guilt is a central component of this in any way, shape, or form. I've been reading critical race theory for a couple of decades now, and I have yet to see that as a prerequisite for either teaching, theorizing, or engaging in any critical race theory analyses.
Okay, thank you. And can both of you talk a little bit as well about how you use critical race theory in your own research? Like, what is its usefulness as you think about how to approach these issues in both K-12 and higher education that you study?
Well, I've utilized CRT in a variety of different ways, but probably the two ways that I've approached it in my own research would be first looking at official school textbooks to see the ways in which narratives about racism and racial violence targeted against African Americans has played out, how it operates in U.S. history textbooks. And I've looked at that at the elementary, middle, and high school level. And when I used CRT, it was to give me a framework so that as I'm looking at that, at those texts and trying to understand the narratives that play out in those texts, what it says about racism. So really it was an explanatory framework. In many ways, it's like these glasses that I wear. It provides a lens for me to see racism and to account for it. I've also used CRT to think about the experiences of pre-service teachers as they're going through their teacher education programs, and in particular, pre-service teachers of color, a sorely underrepresented group in teacher education, and a group that I would say that our nation really wants to increase in the coming decades in classrooms. And so I wanted to see how racism and race are present in the work of teacher education. So those are the two places I've used it in my research and scholarship.
And see, on my end, it's a little bit different because, again, I'm more of a critical theorist of race and not a critical race theorist. But that distinction doesn't really mean anything in terms of the larger debates that we're having right now. But specific to the work that I've done regarding white men and their racialized lives on college campuses, I think that one of the biggest things that really helps me navigate around is that In the 90s, there was all the political correctness, and then that basically got repackaged as quote unquote wokeness in modern day times. And so there's this misconception colloquially that if I just don't say these 8 things, I won't be racist. And instead, what critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, these general frames that frame, or racial frames that look at racism as a structural reality, they allow me to see the consistency of race across time, and then also not to individualize it, not to say that you're a good person, you're not racist, you're a bad person, you are racist, but to see the complexity of lived experiences in relation to these larger structural inequities, but to not lose sight of the fact that we can't just say, hey, I learned not to say these 8 things, and now I can say what implicit bias is, and therefore everything is cool. We need to move beyond a lot of that thinking and really see that structurally we need some really fundamental change if we're going to really address the race problem, instead of a lot of the tinkering at the sides, which is what we tend to do.
Thank you. And Dr. Brown, I think some of your textbook research is maybe a good lead-in to talk about how new legislation targeting critical race theory, anti-bias efforts might impact teachers in how they operate now in the classroom. Have you, I know it's early days, but have you been hearing it all from teachers or talking to teachers about how Texas's new law or other laws in the country might affect their ability to be effective teachers in the classroom?
That's a great question. And no, at this point, I haven't heard specifically from teachers, but I myself have encountered questions about research that might already be ongoing or trying to get started that looks at how racism and race is picked up and taken up as a sort of curricular topic or within teaching. How will you address this House bill, some of the constraints that are discussed. And I think that districts will be trying to figure that out. I can anticipate that it will be a challenge and that it will be something that teachers are going to push back against. I know that I've heard of some reports in places in Texas, I feel like maybe in Dallas, around the Dallas area, that there are some educators who are taking action against this bill. And I think we're going to see the bill in Texas, but I think we're going to see this across the country, where educators are going to push back and say there is no way that on the one hand we can talk about, in the case of history, we're going to talk about history, we're going to expand the narratives of history, right? I mean, even in Texas, we can teach ethnic studies. That will happen in classroom. That is going to happen in classrooms. How can we talk about these histories if we don't talk about racism? There's no way that we can do that. And so I think that there's going to be some pushback, and I think there's going to be some teachers who will be frustrated and not want to teach as a result of how this might play out. So I think we'll just have to keep our ear to the ground to see how local spaces are resisting and pushing back against these efforts.
Thank you. And this is coming out of, a tradition in American culture of, various strands of anti-intellectualism. But Dr. Cabrera, can you talk about how this relates to higher ed culture wars that have kind of happened in the past 20 to 30 years?
Of course, there's a increased intensity around this right now, but this is not new by any stretch of the imagination. When we were in the talking earlier, we were talking about the Ron DeSantis signing the bill into law in Florida, where they're going to be checking party affiliation and political affiliation of people within institutions of higher education. And he kept saying this is important for intellectual diversity. Well, that term has been a buzzword since the mid-90s. It's not something new. It's it's been this whole prescribed narrative where higher education is a bastion of of liberalism. And then here's the big leap. It says to left-wing indoctrination. And anyone who's taught in a college classroom knows I can barely get my students to read all the readings that we have. How in the world? I mean, I don't know who's indoctrinating. I don't really have that. That would be an incredible feat. And I'm not trying to make light out of it, but in some respects, it shows. If we start unpacking the narratives, they just don't hold up very well. The biggest one is that we need to be really clear that when they say intellectual diversity, it means more space for conservatives, more space for white people. And I don't mean to be so blunt in that analysis, but if we flip it on its head, we're not saying I need a Marxist in the business school because that's intellectual diversity, or I need a creationist in the biology department. And that's been, and so we're not really having an honest conversation about this. It's a buzzword that is, in many respects, it's that whole issue of the you have a solution in search of a problem. You have this predetermined narrative that right-wing folk are being oppressed and suppressed, and higher education is just a bastion of liberal and leftist indoctrination. And we've been having the same fight over the last 30 years. And so it keeps playing out and it keeps playing out. The big difference, I think, between K-12 and higher education is that with academic freedom, academics have a slightly bigger, we're protected a little bit more on a national level to engage in controversial subject matter. It's not saying that we don't get a lot of pushback, but that relative to teachers, we have a little bit more protection around that. And so it's still very nerve-wracking because you can get lit up on social media, you can get doxxed, you can get all these different things, but there's still something qualitatively different between higher ed and K-12 for that exact reason.
Well, and to your point too, it's not even clear what controversial subject matter is currently trying to be banned. So let's talk about that. Jaime, you've been tracing the spread of information around CRT on social media and in the mainstream media and discourse, maybe in some of the publications that journalists attending the panel represent. What have you learned about how information about CRT is spreading? And then we'll talk about misinformation. But how are those? How is the messaging going out?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about how these narratives are spreading, that we really focus on the central issue of data voids, right? CRT is a complicated idea that I don't even have a grasp on, but that's why CRT is being used as sort of a convoy for all of these other anti-Black, for all this other anti-Black rhetoric and all this action, right? From what we've seen is early on, I think 2 weeks ago, we were noticing that there was a lot more interaction on posts mentioning CRT. What we found was sort of this this formula that was being used where people associated to larger think tanks and other organizations that kind of do the work of coming up with this rhetoric had been really active. After that, advocacy groups kind of picked up these ideas, started showing up at these school board meetings. After they started showing up at these school board meetings, we got headlines about parents and concerned teachers protesting. And all of a sudden you started seeing these talking heads. The person who was at that school board meeting is now on Fox News, right? So that's basically the whole mechanism that we see is going on here. It's kind of a top-down operation that, of course, there are some parents who are out there because they might be scared or concerned, but there is this large infrastructure that has been in motion to get these discussions started and to get people in front of national TV cameras, right? The other thing I think is that that's why it's so important to identify the players when you're reporting on these, right? It's very tempting to just report about a protest that happened in a school board meeting, but if you're not identifying the players, including the speakers, you're only giving your reader a small insight into what's actually happening. We've found that a couple of parents and teachers have actually are actually associated with right-wing and conservative organizations. They're political activists, right? So that's like a huge aspect that your readers are not really, understanding. I've been in talks with folks in Nevada about what they've been seeing on the ground. And they've been dealing with an organization called Nevada Family Alliance. And from what we know, that organization is associated to Citizens for Renewing America, which is run by, I think his name is Ross Bott, I believe, but he is tied to the Trump administration. And he's also tied to these same think tanks. He's tied to Heritage Foundation, right? So he's part of this larger infrastructure that I mentioned earlier. And it's also happening at the local level too. I think with the news that came out yesterday about a meeting in Virginia, the main organization that was kind of like around there, I think we've all seen the headlines about people actually getting arrested, and the organization that was kind of the main organizer there was Stand Up Virginia. And the president of that organization she actually mentioned in another organization, a pro-police organization that she also runs. She actually mentioned that she got a lot of the inspiration for the way she organizes from anti-lockdown groups, right? So we're seeing that happening at a local level as well. We have these clusters of organizers who already have a good formula down as to like what works and how to mobilize people against the cause. And they're using social media to do that. We've seen a small uptick in the number of Facebook groups that are anti-CRT. They're very small at this point, but we have identified a couple that are very concerning that are reaching membership in the thousands. And a lot of these are private. So that's like another thing that we have to contend with. But overall, I think, that really paints, I think, for me, the picture of how all of this was really galvanized, right? And I think that infrastructure is sort of pulling the strings here. And a lot of that's not to say that a lot of the people that we see on the ground, are part of this infrastructure, because we do have to make the distinction between disinformers and people who are misinformed, right?
Yeah, I was about to ask how you make that distinction. Like, do you find that reporters using terms like, say, astroturfing, or connecting these individual groups at local school board meetings to broader trends, is there a most effective way to do that, if that is in fact the case for the issue and local issue they're covering?
Right. I think it's very important to do that if you're going out and covering a meeting. As I said before, it may be tempting just to report about what's going on, but I think that does a disservice to your readers. And I think in these situations, context is really everything, right? And that should be reflective in your headlines, in your leads, in your nut graphs, in your tickers. Like, these people that are out there, they're not protesting CRT. They don't know what CRT is for the most part. So writing a headline that says parents denounce school board against CRT isn't accurate, right? It's only a really small part of the whole picture. And I think local stories too should really take advantage of the fact that they're seeing a very active part of a national narrative play out in their backyards. And they should talk about that national narrative and how it's playing out there. I think that really compelling storytelling that goes further than just this happened at this event at this place and X and Y said this could really benefit local communities in understanding these huge buzzwords and how they are actually playing out in their own communities. And I think that really does lead me to the point that we, the work that we do is not to try to convince people of anything, right? We want to make sure that people are informed. And you really need to think about your audience in those terms, right? You want to make sure that when people confront this information out in the wild on social media, they already have that information backed up and in their in their minds. And that's why I think what Dr. Brown and Dr. Cabrera talked about is so important, right? Because they're giving you the information to potentially fill these data voids. And as reporters, you need to be the ones to do that, because if you don't do it, other bad actors will.
Thanks. And I think it might be helpful too to kind of distinguish between, professional grievance actors like Christopher Rufo or some of these national figures, versus maybe somebody at a local level who is just confused, or maybe has seen a diversity initiative implemented in what they think is a bad way. I guess I'll just ask this of each one of you. Do you have any suggestions for how reporters can tease those apart? Is there any kind of common ground or legitimate critiques that you think somebody might have with implementation of so-called CRT or anti-racism efforts at a local level?
I definitely think that, of course, there are legitimate critiques, because if there isn't a legitimate critique, then CRT becomes idolatry. It becomes the Bible. It becomes untouchable, and that's obviously inappropriate. But the way to get there, is first and foremost to just be clear about how much do people know about critical race theory. And I've been really pleased to see over the last couple of weeks, there's been an evolution where reporters have, instead of just saying, okay, here, tell us about your grievance, but actually making the folks who are saying their grievance say, what specifically do you not like about critical race theory? Not in general, like, oh, it's teaching kids to hate white people and it's creating racial divisions. It's like, no, what specifically have you read? What are you citing? Like, basically make them defend their sources. And then the second part is make sure that follow up with it, because everybody agrees we have persistent racial inequities in society. And so if we're not able to take a structural approach, if we're not able to take a systemic approach, what do these folks attribute it to? What is, and actually make the people who are doing the protest actually do their own work in the process. Make them, instead of just being able to regurgitate a talking point, actually make them have to have some substance behind it. Because again, I've critiqued, one of my most cited papers is a critique of critical race theory. It's not, and it should be, but the difficulty is that fundamentally, and we talked about this yesterday, that we're not having an honest debate, because it's critical race theory is the boogeyman. It's the same narrative that Breitbart had when they were going to blow the lid off of the racial radicalism of the Obama administration by showing a video of him hugging Derek Bell. That this has been this consistent narrative. It just peaked because of the Trump administration and then the subsequent horrors, after Trump left office. So fundamentally, I think that it's important to just make sure that people who are doing this, you can take them seriously, but make sure that they have a substance to it and ask those deep questions to see what they're basing their beliefs on, because otherwise it's just regurgitate. It's talking point, and we lose the substance in the process.
Yes, I think I would add, I agree with everything that was just stated. And I would, in addition to pushing people who have critiques to actually talk about a substantive critique, I would also add that we should not cease to talk about racism and to hold people accountable for explaining why do we still see various forms of racism that all go back to sort of structural or systemic practices. And I think if we continue to talk about those issues, we're going to have to address what's there. When we spend time suggesting that critical race theory is the problem, we're no longer actually talking about the problem. We're allowing some new problem that didn't exist to take precedent. And because it's critical race theory, they can just continue to just talk about it because people don't necessarily know what it is. It's sort of, to be honest with you, to really be able to find and to dig into critical race theory, You've got to go into scholarship, into academic writing that's often not very accessible to the everyday public, right? So I think it takes away the energy of talking about the very things that we've been doing a good job of talking about, I'd say, for the last couple of years, that's caused this desire to shut down those conversations in the way that we see it playing out right now with this pushback against critical race theory. So keep asking the questions. Keep talking about the actual problem and how people are proposing that we address those problems, because we can't just simply address those problems by saying we are a unified country. Clearly, we can't say that if we see evidence that there are systemic inequities across a variety of different groups, right? So keep asking the question. And to some extent, maybe even move on and stop talking about critical race theory altogether. At least
Jaime, do you have anything else to add from a reporting perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and if I could engage a little bit, Dr. Brown, with what you said, I feel that I think this discussions about critical race theory, I'm not sure if and I don't want to challenge you because I know you have a PhD and I don't, but I think it's very important that we don't let these kinds of campaigns sort of dictate what we can talk about and what we can't, right? I think, but you have a really good point in saying in what you said, that I think focusing in on what this is actually about is very important, and what this is actually about is anti-Blackness, right? And it's an attack on Black scholarship as well, right? And it's I mean, this is what we're not saying out loud, right? But this is the reality. But in terms of reporting, I think you know, it's important to remember that mis and disinformation really works to target people's emotions, and the emotions that are being targeted right now are, and excuse me for being so blasé, but it's white fear and white anxieties. That's why we see so many videos of trending of young white children explaining how, you know, they got their feelings hurt at school, or parents fearing for their child's safety. We've even seen, I've even seen videos trending on Facebook that talk about how critical race theory is going to, you know, basically cause race war or something like that, that like Black people will become violent because they have a chip on their shoulder, supposedly. And these are videos that trend, you know, millions of views, tens of thousands of shares. So in talking about that, and that's not to say that we should center these emotions, but it's important to realize that those are the emotions that are being co-opted and are being used for this type of response, right? And I always go back to data voids. Engage with your community, understand what questions they have, reach out, be in conversation. It is our jobs as journalists to be able to know what our community doesn't know so that we can inform them.
Thank you. You know, you made a point about anti-Blackness, Jaime, but I did want to note that critical race theorists and other scholars who engage with racism and anti-racism, you know, have come out of multiple disciplines, including Asian American studies, Native American studies, and other disciplines. And I thought, Dr. Cabrera, you might also be able to note and kind of give us some additional context. We talked about higher ed context, but this might also feel like deja vu for you because you were involved in a political fight in Arizona, and I think 2011, I have the year right.
Mm-hmm.
About
well, the bill passed in 2010. Yeah.
Okay, and yes, then ongoing. About Mexican American studies, and so I was just curious if you could talk briefly about how this current culture war might impact what we could call positive efforts to increase multicultural education across the country.
Sure. So, real quick, that for I'm not sure how much the.
Sorry, that was a lot of context packed into one sentence.
Yeah, no, I'll backfill it. That Back in 2010, the state superintendent of public instruction, Tom Horn, in Arizona, pushed for the passage of a bill, HB 2281, that for all intents and purposes allowed him to ban the teaching of Mexican American studies in the Tucson Unified School District. And none of what I have said here is conjecture. Like, these are like his exact words. Everybody agrees on that. So I don't want you to think that I'm putting words in his mouth. But it was absolutely deja vu all over again, because what we're saying, that teaching Mexican American studies, especially what the educators who were doing it would quote unquote racismize the curriculum, which meant to center issues of race in the curriculum so that the students would actually have an understanding about that and what it meant in practice, how it informs their community, and then also thinking about what they could do about that in their everyday experiences. So from that, though, Tom Horn flipped it and said, this is teaching students to be rude, disrespectful, anti-American, anti-white, all of these things that basically it's exactly the same rhetoric that we hear right now that around critical race theory, which makes sense because one, the culture wars go on for decades, and then number two, critical race theory was part. It's not the central part, but it was part of the Tucson curriculum. Now, why it's really troubling for me is it wasn't just that critical race theory was part of the curriculum and students could make sense out of race, but that you had some of the most underserved students in the state actually achieving at the highest levels in their entire district. Like, you'd have like 90+% graduation rates. And then you saw a very similar trend occur also in San Francisco Unified. So it's not just that it helps students make sense out of something, but it's incredibly effective educational practice when done appropriately. And unfortunately, within a couple of years, the whole thing got pulled out, the rug got pulled out from underneath us because of these mandates. And then you have teachers who are under surveillance constantly, and it's exhausting. And then on top of it, that the more, because this kind of misinformation requires a target. It says, these are your targets. This is who the threat is. This is where it's coming from. Those people who are targeted, who are just doing good educational work and good educational practice, get death threats, get the vandalism of their homes, of their cars, of all this stuff, and so in even their families get threatened. And so it's not just some benign out there, kind of, oh, I have a differing philosophy from you, but it actually impacts the lives of the teachers who are doing it, number one. And number two, by limiting what the students can get, it's actually, people went so far in Tucson as saying that the elimination of Mexican American studies, because it was such an effective program, actually led to became educational malpractice. That is, that we owe it to our students as practitioners to give them the best, and we couldn't do it for that reason. And so we're seeing the exact same thing, and I'm really concerned, especially the laws where there's punitive, where individual teachers can be fined or sanctioned in some way, that we're going to be doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. And what's weird is the exact same rhetoric that took hold in Arizona. It's almost like we were ahead of the curve and the rest of the country is catching up to us. And of course, now Tom Horn is running for state superintendent again. And so it really is all coming all the way full circle. But none of this is new. It's all a continuation historically. It's just finding a different target for it, And if critical race theory runs out, then they'll start targeting people who do gender and women's studies, specifically because attacking trans communities is such an easy political target as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I believe there was a bill in the past session in Arizona to fine teachers $5,000 for teaching bias topics, quote unquote. And I do want to mention, though, as much as we've been talking about restrictions on teaching, Chalkbeat has a good metric about states that have been trying to expand multicultural education and teacher professional development, which are backed up by a pretty substantial body of research. So it'll be interesting to see how student outcomes play out across varying states. But One last question, maybe for the educators and academics, and then I think we'll move to audience questions. But so understanding that critical race theory is not taught to K-12 students, what might be an appropriate influence of CRT or some of its terms and concepts be on curriculum or teacher professional development?
Well, I don't think it would be appropriate in most situations to go into classrooms, especially with younger children, and try to teach a theoretical framework. I think the usefulness of critical race theory and any other framework that we might be talking about, whether it's constructivism, which is that's a theory that informs a good portion of the pedagogical strategies that teachers use in the classroom, and they may not even know that that's the term that's used, right? Or families might not know that that's the term that's used. There's a theory behind almost everything that we do. I think that's the power and the beauty of critical race theory. It is an elegant theory that helps us to make sense of racism, and so I think that teachers can understand critical race theory and how it helps us to explain racism as a historic phenomenon that also continues into the present, but just looks different. As has been stated earlier, it looks different. It plays out in different ways. You can use that as you are looking at examples, whether it be from history or whether you're looking at literature or whatever you may be looking at. Yeah. You could also be looking at how students are organized to learn in your school. It doesn't have to just be a curriculum topic. You use that framework to help you make sense of what you see or what you read, and it's a way to account for that. So critical race theory doesn't need to be taught in school as a specific theory, but it helps us to understand race and racism. And in that way, just like any other theory that we might have, and I've said this before, it is so important that we're going to talk about racism, or if we're trying to understand racism, why would we use a folk theory or a theory that maybe I believe is just, my own belief about racism? Why not use a theory that's backed up by history and by data, and that has been theorized by experts who understand the nature of racism? And then you use that to help enlighten future generations to better understand racism when they see it, and so that they don't engage in practices that continue to perpetuate it, if that makes sense. So I would say we still need to have that theory, especially if we're going to talk about racism, and we need to use it to help us to explain ideas outside of presenting the theory necessarily itself as a curricular topic, which I am not familiar with anyone doing that per se, or that would be in anyone's curriculum.
Yeah, no, I'll just add my own fact check of I haven't seen that happen. So Dr. Cabrera, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I mean, it doesn't. You don't necessarily, and I agree with Dr. Brown, that we don't necessarily have to go through the nuances and idiosyncrasies of how much explanatory power does interest convergence have over X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's kind of that's why we're academics. We nerd out on these subjects, and we bore our families over Thanksgiving dinner because they're like, I don't want to talk about that. But a lot of the frameworks can be really can be applied in some very, very important and pragmatic ways. So like if we start analyzing racism on a structural level, it really challenges us to flip the script, because all too often, like you'll go into a barrio community and you'll see persistent inequities, you'll see underfunding, underperformance, all these different things. Well, if you don't have that structural analysis, it's very easy as an educator just to start putting it on your students to say, well, their families don't care about education. They don't care about education. These students are disengaged, instead of trying to look at what are the structures that are facilitating this disengagement. And if you really look deeply at students and where they're at, I mean, the way, I love the example of the way that the K-pop fans went after Donald Trump's rally one time, because that was a way of organizing that was just beyond anything that was available during my time. And if you search for the honest brilliance that the students are going for and build off of that, you can actually change the conditions of school to really meet their needs. Jeff Duncan Andrade up in the Bay Area says, I've never met a student with an adverse relationship to learning, but I've met several who have adverse relationships with school. And so instead of putting it on the students who say they're learning plenty of things constantly, how do we make it so that school adapts to them instead of consistently trying to do that and really do what Ryan used to call blaming the victim mentality, or what some folks now call a deficit-oriented perspective. And so again, we don't need to work through all the nuances of critical race theory to apply these lenses in a very pragmatic way in educational settings. And students don't necessarily need to know those idiosyncrasies to feel the actual meaningful care that they receive as a result of it.
Thank you. Stacia, what do we got?
Hello, I am back, and we do have some audience questions. And audience members, if you're out there and you have questions, please submit them. I'll start with one from a journalist based in Charlotte, North Carolina, who says, our latest flap in the CHARMEC, the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District, is bringing in Ibram Kendi as a speaker for administrators. And Kendi is using How to Be an Anti-Racist for a book study that they're doing. So this journalist wants to know, is this correct? Is this actually critical race theory? I know Kendi is a name I am hearing a lot associated with critical race theory, so I'm curious to hear what our scholars' take is on that.
He has said he's not a critical.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad. Nolan, you want to go ahead? You can go ahead and take that. Nolan, you probably have more information.
I was just going to say, he said this is exactly why we're not having an honest conversation, because Dr. Kendi says, I am not a critical race theorist. He also says in How to Be an Anti-Racist that to be an anti-racist, if you're going to move in that direction, you do need to engage with critical race theory, but it's not the center of his work. And so it's sort of like this, it's like this guilt by association. But again, it has nothing to do with critical race theory. It's all about that anything that's race forward in the analysis, anything that's centering race in the work gets lumped. It's all critical race theory. So in a technical perspective, I don't know how many times he's had to say it publicly. He's not a critical race theorist. He's said it many, many times. But again, that doesn't matter in these debates, because it's well, the anti-racist structural analysis, it's very similar, but it's not the same thing. But that's why it's just this umbrella term that just takes up everything in the process.
So thank you for sharing that. I was going to say that I'm not familiar with him being a critical race theory scholar, or that he uses critical race theory as an explicit framework in his writing. But I don't know that, and I was going to say, I'm glad that Dr. Keffrelyn was able to tell us what he's heard him say. I would say that let him speak. He's going to talk about racism, and he's going to talk about some of the challenges with racism. And to the extent that something that he may talk about may resonate within the notion of critical race theory, it might be there. I mean, it's an explanatory framework for understanding racism. But that does not mean that he is teaching racism, critical race theory, nor that he is a critical race theory scholar. And I'll take it even further. There's nothing wrong with actually learning about critical race theory. I mean, in my mind, it literally is just helping us understand racism. But I do think that we need to be careful, and those of us who are academics are very careful about how we attribute any term or terminology or category to any group of people or to any particular scholar, right? Unless that scholar takes on that identity, it is not our place. We cannot say who that person is or is not. But I want to say, for the record, if he wants to talk about critical race theory, if he wants to actually say that here are some examples of how critical race theory can help us to better understand how X, Y, and Z has happened, and how you can be a better educator or more racially equitable educator by using some of its tenets and principles, there's nothing wrong with that either. Why not actually learn what it is that he's offering, or whomever is offering in the context of talking about critical race theory,
Yeah.
rather than assuming that we know what it means.
Well, I want to move on to the next question because we have quite a few here. So we actually have someone from the Austin American Statesman, Sarah Ash, who said that she's curious if any of the panelists have advice about how to cover these debates factually when there isn't a clear, there's clearly confusion about the terms. So how can journalists write about this effectively when the community itself doesn't understand what critical race theory is? And I know we've touched on this a little bit, but I was just curious if you all had any additional insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Dr. Brown, that piece that you actually were quoted in, I think it was the Texas Observer, did a really good job of really reporting out the main issue, right? Like, I think the piece really focused on the bill in Texas. So there wasn't really like protests and like political activists saying that they're teachers, that scene wasn't there, but it really like laid down the facts and saying that, this is happening in Texas, but this is sort of just part of this larger narrative that's going on, and a lot of it's based on mis and disinformation. And it did not miss the chance to include that at the top of the story, right? And in many ways, that is the story. The story isn't that CRT is being debated or that CRT is controversial. The story is that CRT is being made to look controversial, right? And I don't know, Dr. Brown, if you want to talk a little bit about what you actually spoke to that reporter about, that might also help the folks in the room as well.
Well, I mean, I think, critical race theory itself, this is an interesting dynamic, and Dr. Keffrelyn has sort of addressed the fact that this isn't new. Critical race theory is just a proxy. It's a term that's being used as a catch-all to talk about anything that addresses culture, diversity, or that asks us to think about difference or inequality or just unequal power relationships. And for those who don't want, there's a sense that I would think if you really want to understand critical race theory, if you really are trying to understand it with some level of sincerity, you would try to understand it. You would try to parse this out. I mean, there are things that are being brought together that, in my mind, there are some very fundamental sort of base level understandings of diversity, just diversity, that are getting conflated with a study of structural and institutional and systemic racism, which both of those play an important role in our society and have been with us for a long time. But if we can't talk about diversity, we can't even address the fact that all of us don't come from the same sort of backgrounds, that we don't all bring the same sort of experiences to the classroom or to our curricular experiences. If we can't talk about that, because that's getting linked with cultural diversity, that's the danger. And I think I discussed some of that, that we've got to be careful that we are not allowing this sort of narrative that wants us to not address difference to take over the conversation. We are a country of differences, and we are going to become even more, it's going to become more and more diverse. And I think that those are some of the fears for some, and also a fear that maybe there's some traction in this conversation about racism. I can't tell you the number of students who come to my classroom who learn about histories that they had never had access to before. And they say, why did I have to come to college before I could learn that? Well, that's one of the reasons why people don't want some people in college, to talk about ethnic studies or to talk about those narratives that have historically been left out of the curriculum. These are not new concerns. We've been fighting over curriculum at least since the 1800s, right? So I think I discussed some of those things in that piece. And I think for those of us who are sincerely trying to understand race and difference, we need to start asking those questions and not allowing talking points to just gloss over, because the talking points aren't really trying to get at any sincere understanding. They
Right.
just want to try to shut down the conversation.
And I also wanted to correct myself really quickly. It's actually in the Texas Tribune. And yeah, I mean, I think that is the story here, Dr. Brown. You've just pointed at it very succinctly. Like history, there's nothing wrong with teaching accurate history, right?
So there's a couple of questions about terms, and I'm seeing one of the terms that people are saying that is getting conflated is also just the term equity. And so, do you have any thoughts on this debate over, equity and critical race theory, and what seems to be an overall push towards colorblindness in this debate?
So the big one, part of the reason why equity is being thrown out there is that, folks start using that not just of equity of opportunity, but equity of outcomes. And then all of a sudden that starts saying that becomes redistributive. And the reason why that equity is being used as a terminology right now is actually intentionally to provoke white fears in the situation. People understand that white folk are on top. And it's like, oh my God, how much am I going to lose if this actually happens? And that's the crux and the core of why equity has become part of this debate. When in reality, equity really isn't much of a central component of critical race theory, because critical race theory would try to reimagine, like if we were really going to fundamentally restructure society to basically uproot systemic racism and change it and dismantle it, equity wouldn't really be part of that conversation on a technical level. And so again, it's more of the framing mechanism to try to provoke white fears in the situation. And then the irony, of course, is that you said that color blindness is that path forward. And oh my God, if I had a nickel for every time people use Dr. King inappropriately, that's the first thing. If somebody throws a Dr. King line and it's just content of their character, please follow up with that, because that's probably all they know about Dr. King's legacy. Because he was a radical democratic socialist who was also very race conscious in all the work that he did. And to sit there and co-opt that and try to take some moral high ground in that because you're co-opting Dr. King's message inappropriately is very, very callous in the process. But the point being that they say we can only have a colorblind approach. We can only have a colorblind approach. We've been having the same debate for 20 years. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racist was doing that in the early 2000s. It was arguing around that in the early 2000s. But the point being that the reason why you say only a colorblind approach is that you start changing those white fears and saying, no, white folk, I got your back. I'm on your side, because you're not going to experience any harm if you go in my route, because we're colorblind in this approach. So the point being that equity is meant to heighten white fears and colorblindness is meant to dissuade white fears. And that's really what those terminologies mean in practice in the dialogues that we're having. In reality, like I said, equity is not part of critical race theory, and colorblind racism is kind of critical race theory adjacent, if you will, but it's more rooted in sociology.
Well, we're going to have to stop there, and I really apologize to our audience members. We had so many questions. And again, a lot of this is over terminology that reporters, are thinking about how do I use this? How do I use critical race theory in reporting when the term has just been so muddled and co-opted? So it sounds like this is really an issue, reporters, that we're all working through, how to best represent this. And so we appreciate all your questions, and I'm really sorry we couldn't get to them. Someone said maybe we can have a part 2 sometime. I would love that. Yeah, so thank you again. We are going to have to wrap up. Thank you to our guests, all of our speakers, and to Ruth, our moderator. The last thing I'll say before we log off today is that you're going to get a survey pop up right after you close out of this GoToWebinar screen. And so please give us your feedback on this webinar today or any ideas for webinars in the future. Really appreciate it. And so again, thank you. This is a really complicated conversation, and we appreciate you trying to help us parse through you know, a small piece of it. So thanks everyone. Take care. See you next time.